Mission Chats with Jon Crowe.
This episode of Mission Chats is the second part of my conversation with Michèle Phoenix. In the first episode, talking with her, she shared her interesting backstory as a missionary kid. And now, as we take this conversation further, she shares some insights into what her ministry looks like today. So I hope you'll enjoy this episode. Yeah, so I'd love to hear, obviously we heard a little bit, used to teach and wear a number of different hats. How did that morph into what you're doing today? What was kind of the process there? I think cancer was one of the steps that took you out of teaching. So if you want to expand on that.
Following me.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah. As I mentioned before, I loved BFA. If any of your listeners have ever been to the foothills of the Black Forest, right at the intersection of Switzerland, France, and Germany, and been there at this moment of the year, just saw pictures today of the blooms on all the trees. It is stunning. The students were fantastic. I felt like my entire life of experiences and learning were finding their purpose in mentoring the students under my care. I worked in the dorms as well. I ran candlelight dinners. I mean, I loved it. The only thing that could have taken me away, honestly, is something as powerful as cancer, because I would still be there today were it not for that first diagnosis. I got treatment in the States, went back in 2008 and spent that year there. But in the spring of 2009, I started to have this very odd for me sense that it was time for me to move on. Now, MKs by definition either have overdeveloped wings or overdeveloped roots. This is because of the number of transitions they make usually in their youth.
Would you unpack that for us?
Yeah, we say we move so much in our lifetimes. The average for TCK, so this is all children who grow up in cultures other than their own for a significant number of years. So we're talking military kids, business kids, diplomats kids, missionaries kids, and a couple other categories. The average is 8 major moves by the age of 18. So we're not talking a move across town or even a move within the same culture. Right. We're talking planetary shifts, right? So because of that, anecdotally speaking, probably between 80 or 90% of MKs have overdeveloped wings. They can stay in the same place for a certain amount of time, and after that, they have got to move. For some MKs, it's 6 months. For others, it's 2 years. Totally different topic, but this plays out interestingly when an MK marries a non-MK who has roots. So the other percentage, about 15% of MKs have overdeveloped roots. Because they have moved so much, you cannot move them anymore. And that was me. So I spent 19 years in Germany living in this below the ground basement apartment. It did have some windows. Infested with all kinds of spiders and crumbling floors and 3 different kinds of tiles in the kitchen and no dishwasher. And I had frequently had parties of 15, 20 kids over. I lived there because I have overdeveloped roots. So for me to wake up one morning and think it's time for me to move on, I knew was not an instinct of mine. That wasn't coming from me. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized, and this was the rationale that made me leave Germany, if I only have 1 or 2 years left to live, what legacy do I want to leave behind? I am a single woman. I have no children. My legacy has to be something other than that. And that is when I started to think in terms of my lifetime as an MK, and then by then 20 years serving MKs. How can I use what I have learned and the experience I've had to further help the world in general, the Christian world, the church, missionary parents, MKs themselves, to understand what makes them unique, to be preventative. There are some things we can prevent that are chronic in the MK population, and then to be restorative. There's healing to be found even after some of this toxicity can be identified. And I stepped away from BFA. It was my first year-long HMA in 20 years. I needed to untangle my fingertips from German soil to be able to make the actual decision. And I went back at the end of that year and packed up and came back to, ironically, again, to right next to Wheaton, Illinois, that I despised my first time here as a student. And I have found these Americans, these monocultural people who have never stepped foot, some of them outside of Illinois, I have found them to be good, beautiful image bearers. I formed a community around me that I can't deny. So that's how I got to changing into this ministry. It started with a lot of writing, morphed into a lot more speaking. So I do a lot of different things. I speak to missionaries conferences, to pre-field conferences, missionaries overseas. I believe that if we're going to change the systems that have caused some of the chronic ache among MKs, it's got to start with agencies and parents. The MKs themselves, we can help prevent, restore. But if we're going to change systems, it's got to come through that. So lots of writing on my website. There's a whole category that is just MK articles on really difficult subjects, MKs in the occult, MKs in sexuality, MKs in faith, MKs in permissions they need. That list of articles has turned into a podcast that I started, as everybody else did during the pandemic.
Sure.
It's called Pondering Purple, and I thought it was just going to be this little Band-Aid until things moved back to more normal. And I think we're over 30,000 downloads now.
That's awesome. Wow.
And it's really just the audio version of my articles. That's all it is, me reading the articles. And then just going to churches where I'm asked to go and speak, helping churches to understand their MKs, participating in the Global Mental Health Summit recently to help caregivers to understand MKs, because the main misconception, I think, in the Christian world is that MKs are going to process everything the way their parents do. They are going to process things exactly the opposite of how their parents do a lot of times, because their parents have clarity about culture because they grew up in one culture and were grounded in that before they moved to however many other cultures they added. MKs grow up between cultures. They are sponges that absorb everything that's thrown at them and don't necessarily have the clarity to make sense of all of these pieces of themselves. So that's part of what I speak to the adults who are caring for MKs is don't apply what helps you to MKs. They might need something different or tailored to exactly who they are and what their needs are.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. So if someone wants to catch your podcast or read your blogs, what's your website? How would they find you?
Yeah, my podcast is Pondering Purple, and it's on all podcast platforms.
Okay.
Or you can actually access it through my website. So michèlephoenix.com, MK Articles is the heading of that category. And each article has a link to the audio version as well in it. And I think there are like 35 or 40 specific topics now under that MK heading. So lots.
Fantastic. Yeah, praise the Lord. That's great. Now, as you've shared, obviously, some amazing God stories in your own life, as probably all MKs, myself included, could attest to as well. But how about just something you've seen God do through your current ministry, or some other God story that you'd like to share for the encouragement of those listening?
I knew you were going to ask this question, and I tried to whittle it down.
Okay.
I mean, really, the God stories that I witness, and I do have one I'll tell you, but the God stories I witness are getting to know an MK when she's 12 or he's 12 and watch them grow into their adulthood and watch them, Julia, you know I'm talking to you if you're listening to me right now, and watch their faith deepen and their perceptions change and watch them grow into these purple bodies. That's part of the Pondering Purple podcast. And make sense of the world and themselves and find stability in an ever-changing world and find Jesus and get married, some of them, and have children and pass on a different Jesus to their children than they perceived during their growing up years. So these stories of transformation are just, I mean, they're what get me up every morning. They're what keep me consulting over Zoom every day with agencies and individuals. There's one story, though, because it really reflects on the people who are in this ministry with me, my ministry partners. And it was actually while I was still at BFA, there was a young man who graduated and his parents didn't really understand how big the transition was, or how much help he was going to need in the transition. So the day after graduation, he got on a plane with his guitar in one suitcase, and the plane took him to actually Bourbonnais, Illinois, not far from here. And a soccer coach he had never met before greeted him at the plane, and because he was going to have a full soccer scholarship and he was working in the summer on campus, showed him to an empty dorm and an empty dorm room where he was going to be staying, and that was it. This tough guy who looked 30 when he graduated from high school calls me, I mean, in tears on the phone saying, I don't know if I get a paycheck. I don't know what to do with my paycheck. I don't have sheets or blankets, or I don't have cleats. He was on a full scholarship for soccer and his cleats were tied up with duct tape. That's what he had. He didn't know where to go to deposit a check. You know, all of these things are so new to him. And I just threw out an email to my support team and said, just pray for this young man. He's a fish out of water and there's nobody there to help him get settled. And I went out to dinner with some friends. And by the time I came back, I had emails from multiple people, one saying, here's a plane ticket, one saying, here's the money you need, get him whatever he needs.
Wow.
So 3 days later, I think I hopped on a plane from Germany, flew back to Illinois, got a rental car, drove to Renee, and I was able in the 2 or 3 days that I spent there to completely equip him for everything that he would need and to listen to his transitional angst, which is
Right.
a real thing,
Yep.
especially when you're landing in a culture that is not yours and is supposed to feel like home, but doesn't. And he didn't have a car, he didn't have anything. So he got completely equipped because of the empathy and generosity of people who follow my little work that I do with MKs. And I know for a fact that today he is not walking with Jesus and acts at least like he has rejected faith, but he saw Christians do the Christian thing
For sure.
in that instance of his life when there was such intense need. And I think those experiences anchor deep, and I think they're anchored in him, and they might have restored a little bit of his faith, at least in the people who profess to know Jesus.
Right. Yeah. Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah. And I think that's a piece of your ministry, if I've understood right as well, kind of the whole networking piece of it, bringing people in with different skills or resources or whatever it might be to help minister to those as they, MKs and others as they come off the field, as they go through transition, like you've shared as well, before that all happens as well. Before we started recording here, we were chatting a little bit, and the story you just shared touched on that as well, just kind of the reality. And it's not just, MKs, it can be others in ministry and even just Christian kids growing up. But there is seemingly a large number of MKs who do come back and do walk away from, at least, from where we can see, walk away from the faith. And I guess I was wondering what you would say to parents who are experiencing that.
I would encourage parents to make sure that they live out, demonstrate, embody a faith that is more than a job. That they show their kids in a vulnerable way what it is to grieve as a person who believes in God, to rebel as a person who believes in God, to question, to be unhappy with things the way they are. I think it's really from the perspective of the MKs. I'm not a parent, but I do understand what MKs need.
Yeah.
They just need to see other people grappling with what doesn't make sense, even if there's no answer to it, to know that they're not the only ones, that people who do believe in God enough to follow his calling to weird places in the world,
Right.
that even those people, there's stuff they don't understand. And if you know Jesus well enough and trust him, the stuff you don't understand won't matter quite so much. I would add to that one of the most pervasive and powerful forces right now that I see moving, especially North American MKs, away from the faith, or at least away from Christianity, which might be happening more than stepping away from the faith, is political rhetoric that claims God for things that they have been taught are opposite to God. I'm not going to go into it any more than that. We need to be so careful about what we say in God's name and what we attribute to God in the realm of politics, because the cynicism that I've seen in so many MKs about that can cause them to walk away from the church and Christians. And unfortunately, a lot of times that ends up with them becoming lukewarm and then uninterested in faith, because it's within community that our faith grows and thrives, right? So if they walk away from the community, the faith will dry up in some cases as well. So just to be careful about that. And then the last thing I would say to parents is there are so many strong influences in the life of young people these days. Mom and dad have a huge influence, but so do other factors.
Yep.
And if something happens and your children end up, at least for a while, not following in your spiritual footsteps, it might not be because you did something wrong. It might be because one of those other forces took over. And that's unfortunately, in the world we live in, with the intensity of social media and all of this other discourse, unfortunately, the parents' role and influence, I think, has diminished, especially as MKs get into their teens and early adult years.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a good insight and hopefully some encouragement as well for parents, especially as they maybe are facing these times of transition and or have already seen their kids go through it and turn aside, as it were. As this episode comes to a conclusion, I'm going to pause the conversation here with Michèle, and I hope you will tune back in next time to catch the third and final part of my chat with Michèle. In the meantime, please think of who you know who might enjoy hearing these episodes of Mission Chats and forward them a link. You can send them to missionchats.com or just let them know that they can find it on their favorite podcast platform. As always, I appreciate your listening.
Find us online at missionchats.com